Welcome. I'm Kelly Blazer, and this is the Power of Meditation Summit. And I have the honor of interviewing Fleet Maull. Hello, Fleet. Welcome.
Hey, Kelly, good to see you. Great
Good
to
to
be here
see
again with you.
you. All right. So I'm not reading people's bios, but I do want people to know somewhat of the kind of the depth of your background. You have practiced for 47 years. You're a senior teacher in Vipassana, Vajrayana, and Zen traditions, fully ordained. And your work right now, I think, is really particularly pertinent, and we'll dive into this. But you founded the Prison Mindfulness Institute a long time ago, and you worked really deeply in prisons, both with correctional facility officers and also with prisoners and with prison youth. And so let's just dive into talking about that, and then we'll go a little bit more into how the individuals that are listening here can incorporate what you're doing in that work to their own lives. So tell me what your work looks like today, 2 weeks or so after the killing of George Floyd. I'm sure you are a busy man.
Yeah, obviously, I think this has been huge for all of us, obviously, and a real wake-up call and long overdue wake-up call. And yeah, in terms of Prison Mindfulness Institute, which actually our parent name was Prison Dharma Network, it's still our legal name, and that's the organization I founded while I was incarcerated myself. Back in 1989, I was in a federal prison on drug charges for 14 years, and that was kind of like my monastery time. I had been involved in transformational work a long time before that, which begs the question of how I got there. But suffice it to say, I was sick-headed. But I had all that time to really deepen the work, and I've been out for about 20 years. And so Prison Mindfulness Institute, or Prison Dharma, has four divisions. And Prison Mindfulness Institute is all about working with at-risk incarcerated returning adults and youth. And that's probably still 75% of our work. But we've also, for the last 11, 12 years, had the opportunity to work with correctional officers and other corrections professionals. And that's a big part of my personal work these days. Before COVID-19, I was on the road constantly traveling, training correctional officers all over the US and in Canada. And now I'm doing it online and working with other forms of law enforcement and public safety professionals as well. So I still do work with prisoners, and when I can, when we get out of this, I will still be going into prisons and working with prisoners. And but a big part of my work is working with law enforcement. And right now we have two weekly Zoom calls, one with corrections professionals and other public safety professionals in the province of Ontario, where we have an ongoing program. We have a model we've developed called mindfulness-based wellness and resiliency, and it's giving public safety professionals skills to do their job in a different way, which is less damaging to them, which is going to get better results for all of us, and skills they can use to take care of themselves off shift, to become more resilient and be less negatively impacted by a job, which really the nature of the job is ongoing exposure to chronic stress and both primary and secondary trauma exposure. And that's why you see so much burnout in that profession, and why the suicidality rate is 3 times that of the general population. Really, the data among correctional officers, especially those that work in medium to higher security facilities and who are there a couple of decades, the data is similar to, or in some cases more severe than that of combat veterans in terms of PTSD, suicidality, and all the impacts of ongoing trauma exposure. So we're giving them skills to take better care of themselves and do their jobs in new ways. And of course, that's always been a tough job. Any form of law enforcement is a really tough, high-stress job. And unfortunately, the way they've been doing it culturally for many years is kind of go into hypervigilance and, stay in that state and not know how to downregulate, get off shift. And in the old days, they would just go drink it off. And that's changed a bit, fortunately, but still not really knowing how to bring yourself back down and getting too jacked up in the first place. So you're living in that state of chronic stress, chronic arousal, which is very damaging physically and mentally, emotionally over the long run. So we're teaching them new ways to work, but suffice it to say, they are under a lot of stress. And so I'm on calls with them, and we're trying to keep giving them self-regulation tools and giving them the opportunity to talk about what they're going through and trying to influence them in a bigger mind, bigger view. And I've actually been really impressed that they've been able to have frank discussions about the different sides of these arguments. When I'm on the calls with these law enforcement, it's not a really polarized, one-sided argument. There's a lot of nuance to it. They're able to listen to and acknowledge a lot of the views that are out there, either from the protesters or from others, and so it's an interesting world to be working in right now. And
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is the skill set that is necessary for someone to be able to drop defensivity in, a conversation with you or with one another, and how are those skills? How are you supporting people in building those skills?
yeah, absolutely. To me, it really comes down to self-regulation skills. I don't care whether you're talking about law enforcement or being an activist, or you're talking about being in the corporate world, or you're talking about being a therapist and not burning out, or you're just talking about being a human being. Are we able to self-regulate enough to be in a responsive, what I call a relational responsive mode with the challenges that we face day in and day out? Or do we get caught in fear and survival-based reactivity, right? Unconscious reactivity and habitual patterns taking over grounded in fear and reactivity. And that really comes down to our capacity to self-regulate. So we all live to one degree or another in this interface between our conditioning, the programming we have in our neurobiology, and we're highly programmed, highly conditioned organisms. And we got the vast majority of that conditioning before we had anything to say about it, really. By the time we were 3 or 7, most of it in our early childhood. And, we all got our share of the cultural legacy and our family legacy. And there's some great stuff in there. And there's some stuff in there that's not so helpful, as we all know. And some stuff that can lead us to struggle as adults. But we got what we got. We have that conditioning. And we live in a space between that and then the world around us, right? And often in a relatively unconscious, reactive state, driven by the habitual patterns of our conditioning. And so we're kind of getting pushed around in there, right? It's often not a pretty sight. I mean, if we had a really benevolent childhood, so we have a fairly stable self-structure and our wiring is not too tangled up, and we're privileged enough to have somewhat benevolent surroundings, then the ride can be okay, although it's still much less than awake and what's possible as human beings. But many of us didn't have such benevolent childhoods and don't have the privilege of living in benevolent surroundings. And so that ride can be really rough and really chaotic, of just getting continually shoved around by the world. And then when we're all confronting the issues we're confronting today and having to wake up to these things and look in the mirror at ourselves and look at our own biases and prejudices and then try to engage in the world in ways that could actually be helpful, that aren't just going to create more confusion and more harm, it really comes down for me to have skills to self-regulate so that I can navigate my own physiology between upregulating and downregulating and regulate myself into the optimal state for whatever I'm doing, whether it's downregulating to be able to go to sleep at night and get a good night's rest, or it's upregulating enough to have a good conversation to communicate, or regulating back a little bit to just really listen, really take it in, or respond to a crisis, or whatever it might be, or really focus on some task, whatever it might be. There's an optimal physiological, emotional, mental state to be in for that. And so to be able to do that, and self-regulation of physiology leads to our capacity to be able to emotionally regulate, to regulate our own emotions, not to suppress, but to be in relationship with our own emotions so we're not hijacked by them. And all this allows us to regulate our behaviors and access our innate pro-social instincts and engage in the world in the most beneficial, skillful way possible. And of course, meditation and mindfulness is really foundational. I'm not saying it's the only way to self-regulate, but I almost can't think of a self-regulation skill that even if it didn't come from the mindfulness world, it wouldn't, in a sense, be some form of mindfulness, because it's about paying attention, right? It's about paying attention, being reflective. And there's a lot of breath. We teach a lot of simple self-regulation tools like straw breathing, box breathing, diaphragmatic breathing with law enforcement. And they find it hugely beneficial because they didn't have a clue that they could regulate their own. They just see their physiology go, and and then somehow it's there and they don't know what to do about it and they're just in there, and then at some point maybe they try to cope with that by having a drink or doing whatever, but before that they didn't think they had any control over any of that. And when they see they can use a simple tool like straw breathing or box breathing to just bring themselves right back into their zone of resilience or window of tolerance and where they can be more effective and relational, I mean, it's huge. So I think it really comes down for all of us to take ownership. And this is kind of where my radical responsibility model comes in. is to really assume ownership for our own physiological state, emotional state, thought processes, and so forth. Not to beat ourselves up, not to suppress anything, but just take responsibility for being in relationship with it so that we can operate from our best self and engage in the world in a most skillful and beneficial way, taking responsibility for the impact that we're having on others and the consequences we create for ourselves. And we can do that best by really being in relationship with ourselves, deeply embodied in relationship with our own physiology, emotional life, and cognitive life. And there are simple skills to learn to do that. All the mindfulness-based self-regulation tools, they really work. And if you practice them, they're readily available. And so that's really what we're offering almost everywhere. We're trying to give everyone the skills to how can we all take more ownership to co-create a better world together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that you've often said, and this totally resonates with my experience and what I've learned from my teachers, is that we just tend to live so completely above the neck, like the tendency to take flight into conditioned narratives and to essentially only exist inside the stuff of the mind is so strong. And so to even drop down and be able to feel what's happening in the body seems to be the first step. And then once you give people the capacity to do that, not only will they potentially settle, but the things that they are willing to do once they have that, once they've got a different baseline, obviously the choices and the sense of like what choices are available for them on the buffet table of life will transform. So regardless of who you're working with, that seems to be the first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think embodiment is really the key. I think for a lot of people early in our, path as meditators, it depends on how we're introduced to it. And I got all the right instruction early on, but I think it's just a natural tendency to practice from the neck up. And, you have this crazy mind with all these thoughts and you're trying to come back to your breath and your mind goes off and it comes back, goes off and come back. And it wasn't until I really got reminded again and again by teachers and really started exploring embodiment, fortunately, in a deep way about 30 years ago, that my practice really transformed. And then that's been a steady pathway. Even in the last 5 years, I feel like I've had some real personal breakthroughs in my practice in extensive retreats of finding deeper and deeper and deeper levels of embodiment. And I don't know that there's really any limit to how deeply we can become embodied because our whole body is sensory, all the way down to the bones. Even the bones, the outer white hard layer called the periosteum or the marrow of the bones even have neuronal cells connected with our central nervous system.
Yeah.
The musculature, the circulatory system, all our major organs, the connective tissue, the viscera, it's all sensory and it all feels. And mostly we completely ignore that except when there's discomfort or pain, right? We all know it's called interoceptive awareness or interoception, which is just short for internal perception. So that's how we know when we're hungry, when we're thirsty, if we're experiencing muscle pain, indigestion, a headache, if we're sleepy, that's the body communicating to us from the inside out, so to speak, right? So we're all aware of that, but we're only aware of it when there's some discomfort. The rest of the time we tend to ignore the body, the internal sensory landscape of the body. But it doesn't have to be that way. And when we really focus on cultivating an abiding access to that, abiding awareness of the internal landscape of the body, it translates as feeling physically present and grounded. Other people experience us as being more present, more available. But even, I think, more importantly, it puts us so deeply in touch with our body and all the bodily systems and connects us into our emotional body. And even, this gets a little on the realm of what's current science, but actually there is some current neuroscience that addresses this a little bit, of what sometimes people call subtle energy body, or certainly things that are working like with ki and chi or prana, the pranic things, and the yogic tradition. So, the more deeply we start to get in touch with that, and that really gives us the ultimate grounding and the ultimate resilience. The more in touch we are with the depth of our being that's not conditioned by all these externalities, it gives us a confidence and a depth of presence that allows us to weather the greatest storms and still respond to life from our innate pro-social qualities of kindness and gentleness and compassion and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. What came to mind as you were talking about that is, one of my first yoga teachers referred to ahimsa as not just nonviolence, but the being in a way that others are not capable of doing violence around you, which
Hmm.
could seem like a fairy tale to someone else. But when you talk about this, if we are fully in our interoceptive capacity and feeling ourselves and settling ourselves, then the interbeing, like the intersubjective space between us, is impacted by that subtle energy.
I do think the self-regulation aspect is really profound. But the other really important thing is that that enhanced interoceptive awareness is very much linked with our ability to create connection and intimacy with others. It's linked to the intersubjective space, right? And we know that the same neural networks that are involved in enhanced interoceptive awareness and capacity for emotion regulation and physiological self-regulation are also connected to our capacity to create connections with others and to open into this shared intersubjective space. And we know that what we think of as, whether you want to talk about mind, whatever mind is, some people would just, well, it's the brain and the brain's thinking capacity. So there is that physical brain mind. But then I often talk about the heart mind, which is that intersubjective space. It's what Thich Nhat Hanh called interbeing, and even the sense of self. We all know that, one of the reasons when we experience a really tough loss, and I've had some really tough ones in my life of intimate partners I've lost and teachers, the grieving process is so deep and profound and so unpredictable that because really what's happening is your self-structure, a huge tear and dissolution, you have to reweave that self-structure over time. So our sense of self isn't just encapsulated here in this body. Our sense of self exists in the relational frameworks in which we live, right?
Yeah.
And that's not just something we can think of as an abstract psychological construct. It's a tangible energetic reality.
Oh, absolutely. And I think the cusp that we're on right now is moving from a sense of self within a relationship that is essentially tribal to a connection into all sentience, or at least all humanity, which is,
Absolutely, that more world-centric view, moving from that ethnocentric view to the world-centric view.
yeah.
And the more we can, I mean, I think more in sort of in psychological, philosophical terms, if we can shift our locus of decision making and prioritization, first of all, beyond just what's good for me, to me, what's good for my family, what's good for my community or tribe, and then going all the way out, what's good for all of humanity, and what's good for all sentient beings, what's good for the planet. Because, sometimes they call it the ecological self, right? So
Yeah.
the more we can expand that out. So we can think of that conceptually, and you could even, that some of that work could be done philosophically, conceptually, psychologically, but it's also tangible. It is
Yeah.
literally tangible. We live in a energetic world. The world is enchanted.
Yeah.
We're not skin encapsulated beings. That's a myth. We
Yeah.
are in energetic relationship with the whole world and the whole cosmos. We are part of that flow of energy. And so as we begin to tap into that, the possibilities for the resilience we need to be intelligent actors in the world, to engage in the world with integrity and responsibility for our own, this node. I mean, sometimes one of the analogies I really like is that of Indra's net, which comes from Indian cosmology, right? So the idea of this huge net and sort of like a fishing net where at all the knots of the net, right, where the sections of the net are joined, there's a pearl or a jewel. And the idea of the holographic universe or internet, every node includes all the data, all the information, all the wisdom of the whole net, right? So in many ways, I think my job as an individual being is to be a good node on the net, to be a good node on the net. And that means I'm going to at least add as much value as I receive. And ideally, I'm going to add more value than I receive to the net. But to do that, I have to take good care of myself.
Yeah.
So self-care is important. But then it's not just that. It's about how am I participating in that. And when you line the two up, then the net is helping you be more resilient, right? So
Yeah.
the more aligned we are, so that's really the ultimate source of resilience and our capacity to access our best self, which is really, in my experiential faith and belief, our innate being is innately and naturally compassionate and kind and gentle and loving and relational and cooperative and collaborative. But when fear arises, that gets blocked, of course. And
Yeah.
if we get fearful enough, we're capable of doing all kinds of untoward things, right? So it's how can we be as resilient as possible? So there's a work we can do within ourselves, I think, really deepen our resources for resilience and our capacity to be more in a self-leadership position around how I show up in the world and more responsible for how I show up in the world. And then there's the ways that we can connect either with partners and friends, our community, but then with the whole world
Yeah.
in a way that we are really sustained. You know, my first Dharma teacher, meditation teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the Vidyadhara Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, one of the really kind of incredible masters that helped bring Vajrayana Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism to the West in the 20th century, and really a visionary, integral thinker, and a really a kind of Renaissance artist and all kinds of amazing being. He talked about we're all living in basically what he called a bank of limitless energy. And all we need to do is sort of uplift ourselves, you know, get out of our constrained me and all my, you know, stuff, and just kind of raise the gaze, raise the posture a little bit, let go a little bit, and you know, feel my own heart. And that doesn't mean I'm not talking about something that's going to be all happy. This could be in the middle of a very painful situation, but
Yeah.
feel my own heart and then open to the world from that heartfelt place. He said there's unlimited energy, like
Mm.
the resourcefulness of this intersubjective being that we're all part of is limitless.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
when we lose touch with, when we contract, we lose touch with that. And then we get into fighting with each other over what we perceive to be limited amounts of everything, right? The scarcity model. There's not enough of X or everything to go around. And so I'm going to have to start hoarding mine and fighting with you over yours. And then we get in all the discussions about all the justice issues about how all that works out, right? And those are important issues. And we do need to structurally change to make that. But ultimately, for me, the ultimate answer is for all of us to train ourselves to open into this more um, uh, you know, it's more like it's kind of like the hive in a sense, except that it's conscious. You know, the one of those most social beings on the planet, other than human beings, are ants.
Uh-huh.
You know, and they do function in this amazing way in this, but it's not conscious.
Right.
It's not conscious, and it's just fear and survival driven. But you know, we can by you know, finding our way into relationship with each other and with humanity and with all beings and with the planet, there's unlimited resources of love and energy and compassion and kindness. It's all there.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's so funny you're looking at insect behavior. My dad talks about that a lot, how insects have even been shown to like perform better if they have insects around watching them. And I think in so many ways, like our way of being in the world is kind of performative, and we're judging ourselves based on what we think or what we project the tribe will do. And when we work meditatively, when we go into this inner space of kind of really being available to whatever different energies are arising, then we start to realize that that same processes can happen externally. So the more I kind of make space for all of the exiled arenas within myself, to that same degree, I can become more available for everyone in the hive or every other node on the net.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's very important what you were just saying, because I'm not trying to express some transcendent view where we don't have to deal with our own individual stuff or we don't have to deal with our societal stuff. Absolutely we do. Shadow work, I think, is really critical and it's been a huge part of my path. So we all have our unacknowledged stuff and our repressed stuff, and we need to do that work. And the work is seeing, acknowledging, and integrating. It's not about getting rid of. It's not about doing surgery on ourselves. It's about seeing the truth of everything that's in our conditioning, acknowledging it, owning it, being responsible for it, and integrating it. And
Yeah.
because there's nothing wrong with any of it. I mean, there's some of it that's not helpful, especially if we act from those places, but it's the human condition. I
Yeah.
mean, it's just a collective human condition. It's what we all struggle with. It's why we're here. This is the game, right? To be in this situation where, you know, the human condition unexamined is really a prescription for being condemned to a life of fear and survival based living. and
Oh,
conflict and all the rest of it. But the
reactivity.
human condition, the very same human conditioning, because job one for any species is survival, right? So we have a whole biology that's set up to survive, the whole negativity bias and everything, right? But once we start examining the human condition, that very same human condition is the platform for the greatest possibilities of awakening and the greatest
Yes.
possibilities of what humanity or all beings could aspire to, right? So it's really about doing the work. So we have to do our own work. And then we, as a society, we have to do our work. We have to acknowledge the shadows. So we have to look at racism and we have to look at all the injustices. I think it's particularly important, and this gets into a little difficult area of conversation, but I think a necessary area. Um, we're kind of in the midst of a cultural wave that's been going on for decades now. That's a very necessary wave that's really bringing us to look at a lot of this stuff, and it brought about a lot of liberation in many ways. So it's so many positive and absolutely necessary and inevitable and absolutely necessary kind of cultural wave we're going through. But like any cultural wave and all the waves we've been through from tribal to, the kind of birth of the ego and warring it said to, the more nationalism, traditionalism, membership club kind of cultural waves to modernity and post-modernity, which is the dominant wave right now. They all have they're all our efforts to deal with greater and greater complexity as human beings. And they all have their enlightened and very necessary aspect, but then they all have their place where they go too far and get self-limiting and they believe their way is the only way. And, so it gets limited. So we're in a wave right now that tends to want to work with all these issues that we have from to collapse it down into who's right and who's wrong and find somebody to blame. And, the whole victim perpetrator kind of binary, and it kind of sets us up in endless conflict, and the strategies end up being about blaming and shaming. It's very normal, it's natural, it's part of the human condition, so I'm not faulting anyone for it. I'm just saying I don't think it's ultimately transformative. So how can we really do the hard excruciating work of seeing all the dysfunction in our society, to see all the structural and systemic violence and racism and oppression, to see it in ourselves, to look in the mirror and see it in ourselves, to see it in our society. How can we do that work without developing a negative view about humanity to begin with, without developing the view that human beings are somehow just fucked up, or that some sectors of human beings are just innately screwed up, or that I'm screwed up, or who are those bad people? Let's blame them and shame them into the right behavior or whatever. But how can we instead do it in a way that we're taking collective responsibility to do the work together, to transform together, and move forward together by doing this tough work, but doing it without losing sight of the fact that this is the work of humanity. It could never have been otherwise, right? We all, like it or not, we all slithered out of the swamp however many millions or whatever it was, millions, I guess, years ago, right? And many millions of years ago. And, evolution is a pretty brutal affair. And believe it or not, we're better than we've ever been. And we still have really serious problems.
Yeah.
And, so if we're going to constantly indict ourselves and indict humanity for how horrible and evil we are, and going back as far as we can, I mean, with that view, you look back in history and the whole planet was populated by nothing but really evil people,
Mm-hmm.
out
Yeah.
conquering each other. And, and so, but how can we have a view of humanity that humanity is doing the work and in the struggle of evolving and transforming and seeing more and more layers of ignorance and structural oppression and biases and racism, and we're doing the work, and it's painful and it takes generations. It takes time. That's not to excuse anything. It's not to excuse anything, and it's not to, yes, it's perfectly reasonable to say we don't have time or now is the time. Absolutely, and it's still going to take time. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but to stay in the work without falling into the demonization of each other or of any groups of people, and really take collective ownership. I think it's and where we can find a lot of support for these views is in the whole world of integral thinking and integral theory. People are talking about postmodernist thinking and postmodernist political theory and activist theory, or sometimes post-progressive. And there are a lot of very smart people out there who can do a better job than I can of seeing how if we can take the big view of these waves that we're going through as humanity, that we can actually capture all the best of all of it and move forward together without having to bifurcate it into, enemies and, the right people and the wrong people and so forth.
Yeah, and it all, as we're evolving, it all goes back to like releasing this insistence upon the I, right? Which is what people have been in spiritual traditions working on for millennia.
Every religious tradition has agreed. The primary, I think it was which one of the apostles? Um, uh, I think it was Saint Paul. Um, um, that in one of his statements that the problem is the self.
Yeah.
If you want to be happy, forget about yourself.
Yeah.
Now, I like Dan Siegel's view, and that he said, well, this idea that we're just going to completely let go of the self and transcend the self. Okay, in some ways, I do think that is the human project to go. And if you study the lives of the great awakened ones and avatars, they are people who, in extraordinary ways, were able to move beyond having a psychological self as their central locus of being in the world, right? It does seem actually possible to transcend that. For most of us, that's a path in which we, to begin with, we may be in a place where we have a fractured sense of self, and we may need to build up an integrated self, right? I mean, the human condition is that, 6 months beyond birth or even sooner, we start forming some kind of self-structure because it's become clear we can't go back to the womb. We're not in that unitary, psychological being with our mother or surrogate parent any longer. So we start building a self-structure just because the alternative is a black hole of emptiness.
Yeah.
And we're not, even as an adult, it's hard to relate to the actual groundlessness of existence, right? So then we desperately have to find reference points for our existence. We start patching together a self. Well, if we have a fairly benevolent, loving, stable home to be in, we're going to patch together a fairly stable self, and we'll probably be high functioning in life. If it's less so, our self-structure is going to have some gaps in it. If we grow up in a fairly brutal or even traumatized with a lot of aversive childhood experiences, we're going to have a lot of problems in our self-structure. And what we may need is a lot of therapy, right? And therapy can be really helpful in helping someone build a sufficiently well-integrated self that they can then do the work of transcending self or deconstructing self. And a lot of us are in both of those. A lot of us who are in spiritual traditions and in therapy at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's created some confusing paradigms because there's a lot of therapists who are also Dharma teachers and spiritual teachers, and some of them do a good job of separating the Dharmas there, and some of them don't, right? So, but inevitably, some of us, I'm not saying you have to be in therapy forever before you can do spiritual work. There's always going to be that overlap. But it's important to realize that, the ultimate thing that separates from the world is me and the world out there. And the world's either for me or against me. And once I'm in that game, that's just the human condition. But what I like about what Dan Siegel says, he says, because it's a lot to ask to, leave everything about myself, my whole narrative, the whole drama of me, the whole, well, maybe he posits this notion of we.
Mm-hmm.
We. And I don't know if it's ever going to take off MWE. It's like me and we together, right?
Yeah.
Because some people say we need to make the shift from me to we, from I to us, right? That's going from the egocentric view to the world-centric view, right? But he's saying, well, maybe we need to bring a little bit of me along. And it's notion of we. And I actually like that. I don't know if it's ever going to get traction because we doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But it does actually, if you take it back out of a conceptual framework and back into what we were talking about before, of developing this deep embodiment and interoceptive awareness, and then opening to the inner subjective space and really beginning to see how we navigate that by being an embodied being who's in relationality with the world around us. There is a quality of we. The me may no longer be the conceptual me, but it still is. We are responsible for this node. We have to feed ourselves, bathe ourselves, sleep enough, take good care of ourselves, right? So I do like that notion of possibly of we.
Oh yeah, it's great. I mean, it kind of reminds me like we are every phase of the pulsation, from the ultimate to the individuated, and we're constantly in this kind of movement in and out, and we feel it on an emotional and psychological level. Like we can get really contracted, and the depth of that contraction can drive us back into a place of wanting to expand and open, and that can really evolve us. So, for anybody who's listening who's like, well, I'm that broken person, that didn't have the benevolent family circumstances and now have all this disorganization psychologically. Like, everyone has their place in this net. Everyone has, and sometimes it's when we go the deepest into the contraction that we find some creative impulse back into the expansion. So that, it Mui feels really right on, and probably a little more accessible than bringing people into like a deep understanding of the tattvas or something more, philosophically complex. So could we talk a little bit before we have to take off, just about the neurosomatic mindfulness practice, and specifically that people are going to be gifted a practice session, and I'd love for them to just have a little bit of an intro to that from you.
Yeah, sure, Kelly. So, and by the way, I am one of those broken people, not anymore, but I grew up in an alcoholic household and had a huge hole in my gut of pain that drove me into drug addiction and all the craziness of the 60s and the counterculture. And I ended up in federal prison and, lived in a complete traumatizing environment for 14 years. And here I am out in the world teaching resilience, right? So, our transformed brokenness is our strengths, that notion of the wounded healer. But, and I would say we are all responsible for the entire net.
Mm.
We're responsible for each other. We are our brother's keeper, but we're not to blame for the net. We're not to blame for our brother's situation, but we are responsible for and responsible to each other and for the healthy functioning of the entire net, to use that Inder's net notion. It's a very different notion.
Yeah.
So neurosomatic mindfulness is a methodology of mindfulness and awareness meditation, or mindfulness of body, mindfulness of breathing meditation, designed to really enhance interoceptive awareness as well as external awareness, and to take that journey really, really deeply, and to do it in alignment. Well, let me say a little bit about where it comes from. All right, so I've been practicing for 47, 48, 49 years, somewhere in there. I started around 1972, whatever that math is. And so I started with a Taoist technique, living high up in the mountains, in the Andes Mountains in Peru, in the Sacred Valley of the Incas, and with a book from The Secret of the Golden Flower, I think it was, and learning to practice on my own. And then I moved into Buddhism, and I've studied in the three major contemplative Buddhist traditions dominant here in the West: Vipassana, the Theravadan, Zen, and Tibetan Buddhism, and probably most deeply in Tibetan Buddhism. I've really done a lot of depth of practice in all three. And so, shamatha practice, Vipassana practice, Zazen, and then getting into more formalist techniques of Shikantaza, Mahamudra, and Dzogchen. So I've been at this for a long time. And so all this is really an integration of what I've learned directly through my own practice and study, and especially influenced by some of the teachers that really pointed me in the direction of deep embodiment, thankfully, in the last 25, 30 years. And then having really embraced and become a student of neuroscience over the last 15 years, and more so every year. And I'm not a neuroscientist. I have a degree in psychology, but I read the literature. I don't just read the popular press about neuroscience. I read the journals, and I deeply educate myself as much as I possibly can. So this really represents the integration of that. And I have a neurosomatic mindfulness course online where every module in it has a section where you can access 4 or 5 scientific papers from peer-reviewed journals about the kind of stuff I'm talking about. So it's all grounded in neuroscience, as well as the depth of our contemplative traditions, which have been around for thousands of years. And so it's really about activating an abiding awareness of the internal landscape of the body in sync with external awareness of the externalities of the body and the world around us. But initially, it's really focusing internally, not necessarily, we don't even have to close the eyes. You can do it. In fact, mostly I teach eyes open practice, but it's about going in and really feeling deeply into the body to the point where we can actually begin to feel how our neural networks shift. And 2 primary neural networks that are involved in the practice of meditation. There's, all of us, when we start meditating, the problem to begin with is we can't get our mind to slow down enough to focus on anything, right? We have that chatterbox up there, and we try to put our attention on the breath or something, and then Suddenly 20 minutes later, we go, oh,
Yeah.
wow, that was a long daydream, right? And we're back, and so, that activity is called the default mode network of the brain. It's a set of neural networks in the brain, and it's what activates when we don't direct the brain otherwise. When we just let it be, let it do what it wants, that's where it goes. And it's involved in time travel, it's agonizing and worrying and dwelling on the past. It goes into the future and worries about the future, fantasizes about the future. It's involved in thinking about ourselves and what other people are thinking about us, all of our work to build our own identity and personality, and all the narrative of me, the great American novel of me. And then it's about opinion making, right? We're opinion making machines, right? We have to, one time I had an experience in prison where I was in a 14-year deep retreat as well as an active life of service in prison. So I had a lot of powerful kind of meditative experiences. And it was I remember one time being in my cell, and I was just in such a slowed down, clear state that I would see the mechanisms of the mind very clearly. And so I saw something happen. I can't remember what it was, but I saw the whole mechanism of opinion making go into gear. I could literally just see the whole thing going into gear to form that opinion. And I immediately realized at the same time, there was not an absolute logic in the world that I needed to have an opinion about that thing, whatever. I can't remember what it was, but it was just so it was absurd that I needed to spend energy forming an opinion about that, right? But that's what we do. We're constantly involved in that, right? So that's the default mode network. Then there's something called the task positive network. Now, that's the neural networks in the brain that are gauged when we focus on something. Like if I'm trying to thread a needle, I'm going to engage the task positive network. If I'm trying to play an instrument, if I'm, anything that really requires a lot of focus, if I'm trying to return a 100-mile-an-hour serve, focus playing tennis or something, so that kind of focus. So when I do direct my attention through meditative disciplines, right, I have an object of mindfulness, and I place my attention on the body or the breath, then I'm beginning to engage the task positive network. And these two networks are mutually inhibitory. To the extent that I can stabilize the task positive network, the default mode network is inhibited, right? Now, it's not easy to do to begin with, but it's a lot easier to do if I'm embodied, right? The deeper felt presence of the body I have, the more that anchors me in the task positive network, anchors me in the present moment, makes it more difficult for the default mode network to re-engage or for me to go back into distraction and wandering mind, and easier for me to come back. So I have this deep anchor in the felt presence of the body. And again, I don't know what the limits of that depth are because I'm still exploring and it gets deeper all the time, right? So we can actually begin to feel that and recognize physiologically. I don't know yet whether we can feel into the brain and feel that network switching in the brain, but we can definitely feel the result, right? We can feel the changes in cognitive activity. We may even be able to feel, and this is pure speculation here, I'd love to see some research at some point. It may be that, there are no nociceptors in the brain. There aren't pain receptors in the brain, but the brain is what translates pain that we experience other places in the body. So whether to say the brain itself feels is a big question, but certainly brain activity may be felt on the interior of the scalp, just as heat, as activity, as energy. So anyway, whether we'll actually be able, but we can certainly feel the results. That's one of the, I think I'd love to see more research in this. But I actually think this could be an evolutionary breakthrough for humanity, especially when young children start to get trained in this and develop these capacities of self-regulation throughout their lifetime. I think one of the next evolutionary breakthroughs would be human beings who self-regulated at an entirely new level and
Mm.
therefore are able to engage in the intersubjective field at an entirely new level, which
Mm.
could even, some of the science fiction stuff of kind of, the idea of the pod, mind reading, mind meld, all that stuff. If people can imagine it, it can probably happen. But I think it's going to be grounded with this depth of intersubjective awareness. And I don't know that I'll get there in my lifetime, but I think young children that start in this path, could. So anyway, I think there's a lot there for this. So this practice that's what it's really designed to do, to get us into the depth of the body in such a way with an awakeness that we can not only self-regulate it at more profound levels, but also engage in the intersubjective field in ways that are really quite profound. I've had the opportunity to work with some amazing facilitators and trainers in my life and doing large group processes and so forth, and working with areas with a lot of conflict, all kinds of different things. I've worked with lots of different people. And some of them, they just seem to be magical, right? Like, how did they see that? Or how did they know to say that? Or how did they know to ask that question? I didn't see that at all. You know, they just seem to be magical. But with my own training, my own path, I now realize they were just literally seeing what I wasn't seeing, because they had done the work to be awake enough and be tuned in enough to the inner subjective field that it's just very obvious to them. They're seeing it just like it's on a TV screen, right? And so I think our level of skillfulness can be so much more profound with all this. But for me, the ground is doing our work to initially become more embodied. And the thing about that is that it's already there. My experience is there's a underlying vitality presence that is in part physical and maybe in part energetic. Where the line is between those two, I don't know. They're probably on a continuum, but it is even part maybe what we think of as subtle energy or the pranic body. But there's an abiding presence there. We don't have to create it, but the more we tap into it, then it starts to always be there in the background. And it becomes this abiding presence. And that's why we meet some human beings that are just, wow, they walk into a room, the whole room wakes up, right? Because their presence is that quality of embodiment, right? Certainly Trungpa Rinpoche was like that, you know. And I had the good fortune to meet some other spiritual teachers who had just amazing presence. And it wasn't just the charisma of people who kind of are used to being a celebrity and a lot of people's attention. It's very different. It's very different than that, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually met Obama once, and I felt that in his presence, this kind of gravitas, and no matter what you think about his policies. And it's interesting right now, I feel like with so much more kind of attention to what's been lost in, just to kind of bring it full circle, what's been lost in the framework of racism, the cultural connections that have been lost have been really, really profound. And if that can be recovered, then I think we have so much to gain from, as people like myself and yourself, like white people who have kind of received this education through a colonized mind, a colonizer mind, a colonized mind. Like, we've just lost this capacity to really feel into each other and trust each other, and trust even maybe the wisdom beings that are holding us in our unity, and to also feel it in the body and be able to move in the body in a way that has like fluidity and freedom. And from what I've seen, my partner is Cuban, and so we've spent a lot of time there. It really does feel like even there, and obviously that's a diaspora that's been really broken by the transit, but even there's this kind of endowing in the children, this connection into what we're talking about, like through their cultural lens, but this awakeness to the self and this presence in the body, through dance, through trance states, through this a whole different understanding of how we get to be here on the planet. So
yeah, and that's how we heal as well. And I want to be clear, for me right now, Black Lives Matter is really important that we're centering that, and it's going to be important for a long time. And there's other things, other people, marginalized groups of people and so forth. We need to center these things, and we really need to look at these things. And I think we also need to do it with a bigger contemplative view and do it in a deeply embodied way. There's I have a colleague who's doing a huge summit. I can't believe how big it is. I just finished a summit. You've done several. I participated in a bunch of them. He's doing a summit in the fall with 1,000 presenters. I can't even imagine.
God.
Yeah, it's going to have 11 channels, and he has this huge team. And right, so anyway, it's all about embodiment. It's all about embodiment. So I think that really is the work, and that's how we heal. Interesting. I was doing an interview with Bessel van der Kolk, who's an incredible trauma therapist, and he wrote the book, The Body Keeps the Score, right? And we were talking about, some of the ways that we heal trauma is vocalization, right? Vocalization, singing, swaying, moving, humming, moaning, dance. Well, who's been doing that forever? People that go to church, and across all kinds of traditions, right? Because human beings, we've intuitively known that's how you heal trauma. And then Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory, I think, is also very important when you look at how do we co-regulate. Once we self-regulate and we tune into the inner, then we can co-regulate. We're all doing it anyway to a degree, but we can do it much more skillfully and consciously. We co-regulate, and it has a lot to do with the tone of our voice. It has to do with our facial expressions. It has to do with our embodied presence. and we can learn to co-regulate safety with each other, and then we can co-regulate transformation with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're going to get to learn how to do that online, which will be really interesting. I mean, and talk about tasking our psychic capacities.
Well, interestingly, I just did an interview with Stephen Porges. Well, I did two. One I produced where my friend um, uh, Gabriel Cram he interviewed Stephen for our summit we recently did. And then I just interviewed Stephen again for our Engaged Mindfulness Institute teacher training program for our trauma module for the advanced program. And in both of those, we talked about that, and especially the first one, that now we're trying to do that through Zoom or other video conferencing. And so what is it? I mean, one of the challenges here, like even with this, I'm looking up at the camera, so, your audience will see me looking at, but if I want to look at you and see you, I have to look down a little bit. So now on camera, it looks like I'm looking down. So we're going like that. And unfortunately, my screen and the camera are a little further apart than even if I was using the laptop's camera, right? But you see people on Zoom, we're going like that all the time, right?
Yeah.
But, you have to navigate it, but we can still figure it out. And I think we discussed it is challenging to co-regulate through this medium, but it's possible.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible. And we need to learn to do it because, we will go back to live things, but I think this is also going to continue to be an important landscape of our human interaction. So we need to learn to co-regulate through Zoom or Skype or whatever we're using.
Yeah, and we get to. It'll be fun. I mean, it'll be interesting, and it's good for the planet for us not to need to move around so much. So,
Absolutely.
All right. Well, it's just always such an honor to talk to you, and I feel like the way that you bring such a broad perspective, and especially at this time when so much healing is needed, it's just so valuable. So much appreciation to you, Fleet, and we'll make sure that people have links to your website, which is fleetmaull.com, and also the Heart Mind Institute, hmi.fleetmaull.com. Your book is Radical Responsibility, your most recent book. You also have another book from when you were in prison, which I think is called Writings from Hell, or what is it called?
Dharma in Hell.
Dharma in Hell. Yeah, which I haven't read. So I'd love to pick that one up as well. All right. So take good care, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you for doing this good work to put this summit out to the world.
Absolutely. May it serve. All right. Be well.